Did you hear the story about the guy who had one single weakness and told it to exactly the wrong person? I know. The worst part is, nobody forced him.
I have told you everything. I will trust you.
I hear you.
The guy was different. Very different. The kind of person who seemed able to handle any problem. No one could intimidate him. The bigger the challenge, the more confident he seemed. And that gave him a reputation. Everyone said the same thing. This guy is impossible to bring down. That was around the time he met a woman. They started seeing each other. And at least in the beginning, it looked like any other relationship. But after a while, she started asking a strange question. She wanted to know his secret.
Tell me.
Where all that strength came from? What made him seem invincible? He laughed it off, made up some answer. She believed him, or at least she pretended to. The next day, she asked the same question again. He made up another story. A few days later, she asked again, and again, and again. Think about that for a second. If someone asks the exact same question every single day, maybe the answer is not even the strangest part. Maybe the strange part is the insistence.
You haven't answered me.
I've got nothing to tell you.
But he never seemed suspicious. Or maybe he was suspicious and simply thought he had everything under control. Until one day, she would not let it go. She pushed so much, that he finally decided to tell her. This time, it was the truth.
You want the truth? Okay, I'll tell you everything.
And the moment those words left his mouth, the story had already changed completely. Because the one secret capable of destroying that man was no longer a secret. A lot of people know this story. Or at least, they think they do. Because when someone says these two names, most people immediately think about the hair. But honestly, this was never really a story about hair. It was recorded in the Book of Judges. The man was Samson, the woman was Delilah, and the secret he decided to tell her ended up giving his enemies exactly what they had been looking for all along. Strange, isn't it? Almost everyone summarizes this story by saying Samson lost his strength when his hair was cut, but that is only the part everybody remembers. The really interesting question is different. How does someone who had reason to be suspicious again and again keep coming back, keep hearing the same question, and in the end, decide to answer? Maybe this was never really a story about strength. Maybe it was always a story about trust. Did Samson really not see what Delilah was doing? Because from the outside, it seems impossible. She kept asking the same question. He made up an answer. Soon after, someone tried exactly what he had just said. And this happened more than once. Even so, he stayed. It is strange, isn't it? Because we usually imagine major betrayals happening all at once. But in this story, the signs appear one after another. She asks. He lies. Someone tries to trap him. He realizes he's been deceived. And even then, he stays. So the question changes. It is no longer, why did Delilah do this? It is, why did Samson never leave? Maybe because strength was never his real problem. The problem was something else. He believed he was still in control. It is a behavior that shows up all the time. A person thinks, I know what I'm doing. If it gets serious, I'll leave. It will be different with me. But almost no one notices the exact moment when it is already too late. And there is another interesting detail. Trusting someone is not a mistake. Every relationship depends on it. The problem begins when trust ignores what the facts are showing. By that point, Delilah had already given Samson several reasons to be suspicious. Even so, he chose to believe more in what he wanted to feel than in what he was seeing. Maybe that is why so many people reduce this story to the hair, because the hair is the easiest part to remember. But honestly, I do not think it was ever the main point. The hair was only the symbol. The fall began much earlier. It began the first time the warning signs appeared, and he decided to explain them away as if they were nothing. And maybe that is exactly why this story still feels so current. Because sometimes people are not deceived because they lack intelligence. They are deceived because they desperately want to believe. And when what we want comes into conflict with what we are seeing, reality does not always win. If I asked you right now why Samson lost his strength, I think most people would answer immediately. Because they cut his hair. And that makes sense. That is how this story is usually remembered. But when we look at the text a little more carefully, the answer becomes more interesting than that. Across the centuries, one of the best known interpretations is that the hair was never some kind of magical source of strength. It was the visible sign of a commitment Samson had carried since birth. In the biblical tradition, that commitment became known as the Nazirite vow. Because of that, many interpreters understand that cutting his hair was not exactly the cause of the fall. It was the moment when a break that had already been happening became visible. There is another detail that often goes unnoticed. After Delilah discovers the secret, Samson wakes up thinking everything will happen just like before. That he will get up, that he will shake everyone off, and that he will keep going with his life. But for the first time, that does not happen. Maybe this is one of the most important scenes in the story, because it shows someone who believed he knew his own limits, until he discovered he had already crossed them. There is another interesting interpretation too. Some scholars understand that Delilah was never the true beginning of Samson's fall. She was only the final chapter. In that reading, the whole story shows a man who slowly got used to living near the line, until the day he finally crossed it. And maybe that is exactly why this narrative still draws so much interest. It does not only answer how Samson lost his strength, it asks a much harder question. After all, what really brings a person down? One single mistake, or a sequence of small choices that seemed harmless while they were happening? There is a phrase that almost always appears right before someone gets burned. That would never happen to me. And when you think about it, I think Samson believed that too, because he had escaped before. He had already given false answers. He had already seen that something was wrong. And even so, he stayed. Maybe because we have a strange habit. When a bad decision does not bring consequences the first time, it starts to feel less bad. The second time gets easier, then comes the third. And without noticing, what once seemed like a risk starts to feel normal. This happens all the time, not only in relationships. It happens when someone ignores advice because, so far, it has worked. When someone sends a message they know they should not send. When someone hides a small lie, thinking it will never grow. When someone makes a bet they promised they would never make again. Almost no one crosses the line all at once. Most people move toward it little by little. And maybe that is exactly what makes this story so current. Samson did not lose everything on the day he told the secret. In reality, by the time that moment came, he had already grown used to believing he would always be able to escape. Maybe that is the most dangerous trap. It is not trusting the wrong person. It is trusting yourself too much. It is thinking there will always be one more chance, one more conversation, one more excuse, one more opportunity to turn back, until the day there simply is not. And when that day comes, most people look back and think everything happened too fast, but it almost never does. Usually, the fall had been under construction for a long time. Samson did not lose his strength all at once. Before that, he lost something else, his sense of danger. He lost the ability to notice that something was wrong. And I think that still happens. Not always in stories this dramatic, but in small decisions. The ones we justify because this time it is not a problem. Because I know what I'm doing. Because I can stop whenever I want. The truth is, almost no one believes it will be the last choice. Until they discover that it was. Maybe that is why this story is still remembered so many centuries later. Not because it is about the strongest man in the Bible, but because it asks an uncomfortable question. What really makes us strong? Is it what other people can see? Or is it the ability to recognize our own limits before it is too late? Because in the end, Samson's greatest weakness was never his hair. It was not Delilah either. It was believing he could always get out of the situation whenever he wanted. And maybe that is the part that still feels the most current. Most people do not lose everything overnight. First, they lose attention. Then, they lose their limits. And only then do they realize how much they have put at risk. So, my friend, the next time someone says, "That would never happen to me," maybe it is worth remembering this story, because most of the time, that is exactly how they begin. And as I always say, history doesn't repeat. People do.